Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of TM Clips. For today's session, we will tackle the concept of what we call activity sequencing. So let's first tackle the question, why do we do activity sequencing? Well, so far, what we have is the work breakdown structure, which is the decomposition of the project into individual and doable work packages. And then this work breakdown structure was converted into an activity list, which lists down the activities that need to be done in order to accomplish each and every one of the work packages. Now, if you look through the activity list, we have to recognize and realize that this activity list is agnostic to sequence of time. That essentially means that the activity list gives no relationship between the activities in each of these work packages. We, we do not know which set of activities will come first before another set of activities. It is not stated in the activity list. So it is simply a laundry list. You can think of it as though it were a laundry list of things to do. The activity list is also agnostic to time. It doesn't tell you how long each and every one of these activities is going to take. Okay? So the end result of activity sequencing is to develop the logical relationships between all of the activities within the project. One of the key steps in doing activity sequencing is determining what we call the dependencies of two or more activities. So dependencies here refer to the relationships between two or more activities. Does activity A come before activity B? Or in order for us to do activity B, we need to finish off activity X and activity Y first before we can start off with activity C. And to visually represent these relationships between activities, we need to create a project network diagram. The most common of which is what we call a Gantt chart. The Gantt chart is the most widely used project network diagram in project management. This chart is useful in planning a project and defining the sequence of tasks that require completion. In most instances, the chart is displayed as a sequence of horizontal bars. So you can think of it as a horizontal bar chart. These horizontal bars of different lengths represent the project timeline. More specifically, each and every one of those horizontal bars represent the duration of each task that needs to be done in the activity list. In order to create a good activity sequence, we need to understand three fundamental relationships: the sequence, the burst, and the merge. There is a fourth relationship, it's called the mix, but the mixed relationship is simply a combination of the three other fundamental relationships. So let's describe those three. If one activity needs to finish before another activity can begin, this type of relationship is called the sequence. So in this example, activity A needs to finish first before activity B can begin. And activity B has to finish before activity C can begin. Now let's look at this sequence of activities and let me introduce two more terms. Looking at activity B, the activity before it is called the predecessor, and it needs to be done before activity B can start. The activity that comes after activity B, which in this case activity C, is called the successor. And the successor can only start once its predecessor is done. So you'll hear these concepts of or terms of predecessor and successor as we move along the scheduling topics. The second relationship is called the burst. This relationship tells us that once an activity is done, it can trigger the start of two or more activities. So in this diagram, once activity X is done, both activity Y and Z can immediately start. So the predecessor of activities Y and Z is activity X, and the successor of activity X is activities Y and Z. The third relationship is called the merge. This relationship tells us that an activity can only start if all of its predecessors are finished. Okay? So in this example, before I can start activity M, I have to wait that activities J, K, and L are all finished before activity M can start. The last relationship, like I told you, is the mixed relationship. So it is simply a combination of the previous relationships. So just to illustrate this one, before activity L can start, it needs activity J and K to finish first. Same thing with activity M. And once activity J is done, it triggers the start of activities L and M. So it is a combination of the burst and the merge activities. Now let's use an example to explain these three fundamental relationships. Let's assume that Doc Vergara approached you and asked you to create a web portal that will showcase everything about Java. Links to Java resources, simulations about Java, the IDE of the Java environment, and so on and so forth. The end result of this project is going to be that website that contains all of these links. Now, what I have here is a very simplified activity list that you will need to do in order to create this website. So I have 7 activities. As I mentioned before, in order to create an activity sequence, we need to identify the relationships between all of these activities. And the best way to do that is to identify the predecessors of each and every task in your activity list. So take a look at this activity list. What I did was I added a third column called predecessor. What we will put there is the ID of the predecessor of each and every task found in the second column. Okay? So let's start off. Maybe as you look through this activity list, the very first thing that we need to identify is which among these activities is the first activity that we really need to do. Okay, what's really the very beginning of this set of activities. In this case, we might need to interview Server Gara first before we can do any of the succeeding activities. So the first activity here is 1.1, interview Server Gara. Since it is the first activity, there is no predecessor. Okay? Now, once we're done interviewing Server Gara, what do you think can we already do? Well, once we've interviewed Server Gara, it seems as though we can already start off designing the website, gathering the PowerPoint slides, and gathering Java links. We don't need the design the website first before we gather the PowerPoint slides, or we don't even need to design the websites before gathering to finish the design website before gathering the Java links. So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 doesn't seem like a sequence. It seems as though it were a burst. So that means that once we've interviewed Server Gara, 3 activities can start all at the same time. Do you think we can immediately start developing the websites after interviewing Server Gara? No. Why? Because we need first to design the website before we develop the website. So this is that concept of activity sequencing. We need now to sit down and think in a logical manner how the sequence of these activities should play out. So if I just look at the first four activities, 1.1 to 1.4, we might say that the predecessors of these activities are the following. So for 1.1, there's no predecessor because it is the very first activity. 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 have as predecessors 1.1, and you will notice it is a burst. Okay, now you see here that I've already placed the predecessor of 1.5. We discussed that in the previous slide and said that before we even develop the website, we have to wait for the design of the website to finish. So the predecessor of developing the website is designing the website, and that is going to be 1.2. Now, what do you think would be the predecessors of 1.6 and 1.7? Think about it first before you move on at least to the next slide. If your answers were for 1.6, 1.3, and 1.4, you need to organize the content. In order for you to organize the content, you need already all of the PowerPoint slides and all of the Jagava links, then you're correct. And if you thought that once the website is finished and the content is organized, we can now upload the content and the system to the server, then you're right. So the predecessor of activity 1.7 is our activities 1.5 and 1.6. So in summary, what did we just do? We first asked the question, what is activity sequencing? I gave you an overview of what a Gantt chart is. Rest assured that we will tackle that in the next topic. And lastly, in order to do activity sequencing, we need to understand the three fundamental relationships and how they will be used.